All right, I think we'll get started. We're going to talk about mobile websites. My full-time job, I'm a web developer. I've worked on a number of, primarily started with a desktop e-commerce site and then worked on multiple mobile sites, both internally and externally. Rural site author, I made my blog, my email, Twitter. I did turn in the slides and the code for this, so that should already be on your USB, so you have access to all of that. If you have any particular questions as we go, feel free to ask. So I just wanted to start with some really basic mobile stats because this changes so quickly. Smartphones have started outselling PCs, which I don't think is a huge surprise. 23% of internet traffic today is from smartphones. Our production site's about 15%. I remember that was like 11% just a year ago, so I mean that's pretty dramatic, the changes. Smartphone platform market share, Google has a lot more market share now than Apple. We are similar to a lot of e-commerce sites that most of the people that are ordering for us are actually coming from iOS devices, even though there's less of them.
Yes. So those US stats, so worldwide.
These are US stats. I've got links in, I don't know if you guys have access to the notes or not on the USB, but I've got the links to the site where I pull these, and they happen to pull by any country or by worldwide. So these have to be US. So I checked and they were pretty similar as far as to UK, but I want to talk really quickly about the categories. So obviously apps, everybody talks about apps. We're kind of in the same spot now where I've been doing web forever, and I came up during the period of we need to have a website. Why do you need to have a website? Because we have to have a website. Okay, so we'll do a website for you. That's kind of where we are for apps too. I mean, a lot of people just have the expectation that you have to have an app. These are some of the arguments people give me for why they think you should do apps. You have access to the full device capabilities. So I mean, the camera, anything I want to be able to access, that's an advantage of being an app, is you have access to all of the capabilities. You also have the new capabilities available sooner. So in other words, when they start to appear on devices, they tend to appear native first, and it's a while before the browsers have them implemented. Performance has been argued. I would argue personally that performance, if you're a game, maybe that matters. From the kind of site that I run, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, our websites run just fine from a performance standpoint. At the end, I'm going to talk about some performance things you should be aware of to make sure your website is performing well on mobile. But there's no reason for the type of sites that I work on, the performance is going to be a hindrance or a big benefit of being an app. You get constant branding, so the argument that being able to have a website or have an app icon on people's home screen, so every time you're on their phone, they're seeing your app and you get some brand awareness from doing that. And the App Store marketing, so they argue that the App Store is a good place to get found, and you also get a lot of marketing from that. There's so many apps in most of the categories now, I don't think just being in there makes a whole lot of difference. I mean, we're in the top probably 25. We have an app for food in the US. And so you get some awareness with people just because you're near the top, but if you don't happen to fall near the top, it's not a really huge advantage. And again, App Store marketing, if you happen to get picked up from the App Store and they choose to feature you, obviously that would be an advantage. Hybrid benefits, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so they're technologies that as a web developer I would be familiar with. But I also get it to be a downloadable native app that hosts a web browser control, so I get both of the advantages. It looks like an app to my customers, but I get to use some of the technologies that I'm already used to. So again, from an app perspective, the discoverability, the ability to be downloaded, access to native features through the hybrid, that layer gives me access to some of the native capabilities, even though I'm developing it from HTML or CSS or JavaScript. I get the reuse perspective and cross-platform from developing using from the website perspective. And there's some popular tools, PhoneGap, ColorArt's App Builder, some of those tools that will help you develop hybrids using those type of techniques. I'm going to focus on this talk instead, specifically on websites for mobile devices. The reason that I like them, a lot better reach. I personally, for my e-commerce site, because we have a website that works relatively well on mobile, I've ordered from my Xbox, from my Kindle, from an iPad, an iPhone, Galaxy tablet, any of the devices that people pick up and happen to use, they're able to order from our website rather than from a cost perspective. When we're doing native apps, we just can't make native apps for all of those different platforms and targeting all those different devices. So the reach is a big advantage. Leveraging my existing skill sets, so most of my people in my shop are web developers. They already know HTML, they know JavaScript, they know CSS. I want to take advantage of that. To me, understanding the differences, we'll talk about how you can do feature detection, but I want to take advantage of the fact that all the smartphones have browsers built into them. So as long as I'm aware of what features I can take advantage of and use, I'll be able to use the stuff I already have. It's a lot more cost effective for us. The other big one is there's no delay for App Store approval. I mean, that's kind of a pain for us. We do a lot of seasonal and even weekly specials and things that we're constantly changing on our website. When I've got to send that through for App Store approval, that takes today for us anywhere from a week to 2 weeks to get through that process for us in the App Stores. So me, with a website, I'm able to make that change immediately and see it get reflected. That's a big advantage for us. And it gives us the consistency across the desktop and the devices at the same time. It's also a website, so the advantage is, sorry, my voice. It's searchable, so all the search engines can find me. They can link to me like they always do. I get to use all the tools I'm used to. So when I want to do analytics and see how people are using my website, these are all tools I've used for years from a desktop perspective. I don't have to go find brand new tools to do the same things in a native environment. Does that make sense? So this is what we're going to talk about and focus on. So the first thing we need to worry about is the browser support. And so what I personally care about, I mean, people, in the talk here, I'm going to kind of show you some HTML5 features that make mobile development better, some CSS3 features and stuff. And if you've been following HTML5 at all, Ian Hickson, I think is the last name, was the guy doing the HTML5. And they said, when will HTML5 be ready? And he said 2022. And so a lot of people just, whoa, that's going to take forever. I don't care about that. I don't need to worry about that. He was speaking at the time to just when he thought basically two browsers would have full implementation of all the HTML specs. I care about standards. I mean, I want browsers to implement standards so I get consistent behavior. I don't care when the ink is dry on it. What I care about is the browsers that come to my website, and I have a wide range, being a typical e-commerce site. When I feel that the majority of them support the features I want, that's what I care about. We're going to talk about how do you do fallbacks and polyfills and things like that to support older browsers, but that's all I care about. I don't care when somebody's telling me the standard's officially done. And how much better reach than if I had a native app? So again, for most of the stuff that I'm doing, I'm not taking advantage of a lot of the native capabilities. So what I want is I want the better reach. I want to be able to touch all of these different devices and be able to order from our site. So there's two good sites to look up when I find a particular feature I want to use. So I'll show you the can I use first. So when we start talking about these features, for instance, I'm going to talk about geolocation. I can come out to can I use and search, and it gives me a nice breakdown of by browser and by version. And this includes the mobile as well. How well is this supported? So then I can make decisions about, so we use geolocation on our website to tell people the closest store to them where we sell things. And I look, and really it's only IE8 that's a big issue. So I can decide that this is something that I want to do, and I just have a fallback. In this case, for IE8, type your zip code where you are. Right? I'm not going to be able to figure out your location for you. But based on coming out here and taking a look at how well is a given feature supported, it helps me make decisions about should I start using this new feature or not, for me to take advantage of. And based on how many people wouldn't be supported, what type of fallback would I have to do? So let's look at this first. Okay, so we'll talk about feature detection. So over the years, a long time ago, we would do user agent sniffing, so to speak. We'd look at what the user agent was. We'd make decisions on, well, that's Netscape back then, with a particular version. I know it supports this, or I don't support that. There's no way you can possibly keep up with that anymore from the perspective of trying to see what it is and see what it supports. So generally, from a desktop standpoint, we've moved totally away from looking at user agents and focusing instead on feature detection. So I'm going to talk about that here. And the idea with this is I'm not going to try to identify your device or your user agent and then have a lookup to tell me what that actually supports. Instead, I'm going to use techniques to try to figure out, does your device support that feature or not? If it supports that individual feature, then I can use it. Otherwise, I can either ignore you, right? So years ago, we did rounded corners, right? That was the rage a couple years ago. Our designers said, we have to have rounded corners for all this stuff. So we would look and say, well, border radius is a CSS3 property. It wasn't supported in a lot of the browsers that we had. We tried to argue with our designers, who cares? You know, if you're using IE6 and you see square boxes everywhere. That's not a big deal, right? But they actually sometimes want us to do a fallback, and so I'll show you how to do that. But the feature detection allows me to specifically ask, is border radius something that your device supports? And if so, then I know how I want to behave. There's ways to do this manually, so I listed some of them up there. I'm a full-time web developer, like I'm sure most of you are. I don't really have time to look for every given feature, and how do I know in Chrome, this version, is that supported or not? So I use Modernizer. How many people have used or heard of Modernizer? Quite a few. Okay. So the idea with Modernizer, again, it's a JavaScript library that's going to check what features the browser supports, and then it's going to give me an indication for supported or not supported, and I'll show you how to take advantage of that. Generally, it doesn't fix it. You know, in other words, it's not meant to be put in place to fix missing stuff. And there's one caveat that I'll show you to that. But I can either use JavaScript or CSS once the Modernizer runs. I can either do it programmatically or I can do it with styles and say, do you support this given feature? And then I can do what I need to do, depending on which one of those I want to use. So let's look at basic feature detection first. So we're going to talk about video support in HTML5, being able to use that on devices. And so what Modernizer will let me do is I'm going to go out and download Modernizer. And these days, if you've been out there recently, it actually has, similar to jQuery UI, you used to get a single Modernizer JavaScript file. It's grown big enough now that they actually let you configure. So I can come out here and say, I'm only really interested in a few features that I want to detect. Maybe I want to know if it's video, audio, the border radius, and then I can say generate, and it's going to create a custom JavaScript file for me. So again, the advantage of this is I don't have to have a big JavaScript file downloaded if I'm not using a lot of it. So that's why they do this. So I went through that process. I saved off the minified file that has just the features that I want to take advantage of. And then now I can come in here and I can either do it with styles. So what it does is it says for each feature, like video, it'll either say I can do a style that says video, and I can put whatever I want my CSS to look like. Or if I put the no dash, I can do what I want to do in the case where that feature is not supported. So in this case, I'm just saying, I'm going to assume you have video browser support. If it turns out Modernizer says you don't, I'm going to use the before syntax in CSS if you've seen this before, so I can actually add to the content and put a no in front of it and turn it red. And then from a JavaScript perspective, if I have to behave differently, I can also just detect it using modernizer.video. So we'll pull this up for IE. And it says, yes, that's supported, great. If I put it in compatibility mode, we'll see that it's not supported like you would expect. We're going to get into more complicated versions of this. Let me actually show you how it actually runs. So he's done all the work. I won't actually open up Modernizer to show you what it does, but I will show you how it behaves. If you've ever looked at it in developer tools, you notice it adds a ton of classes onto your HTML tag. So it did all the client-side detection. It knows, for instance, for border radius, it knows how to set it, see if it's supported or not, and then it will actually go add that class onto my HTML tag. That's what it uses when it's doing the styles or when it's using JavaScript to determine whether that feature is supported or not. when we talk about browser handling, so I'm going to talk a little bit about different HTML5 features. One of them is taking advantage of the new structure elements, so the headers, the footers, those kind of things. It's important to understand what are browsers going to do by default if they don't know how to understand those different tags. And there's a number of ways to fix it. Basically, most browsers, and I'll show you what it looks like if they don't support it. So I want to start using things like header and footer. And the reason I want to use that is search engines and user agents are smarter than about what exactly this content is. So instead of having a million divs in my pages, now I've got 900,000. Right? Some of these are going to be actually defined structure ones, and then I've got other divs. But this helps the user agent understand what this stuff is. So if we look at what this looks like in IE again, that's the kind of behavior that I wanted. I can do my styling. If I put it in compatibility mode, this is what a browser would do by default. And so you just need to be aware of how to handle that. There's a number of different ways. There's an HTML5 shiv that you can get. If you happen to use Modernizer anyways, this is the one thing that I lied and said it doesn't fix anything. This is the one thing it actually will fix. So if I go back and hit that again, it's actually done the definitions I need in order to support those new structural elements. So if you can use Modernizer anyways, that's one of the advantages of doing that. We talked about polyfills and shims. The idea with these are basically when I come to a device that doesn't support a given feature that I want to use, usually, like with the rounded corners, I'll go back to the designers and say, I don't care. I just want to use the border radius. Let's move on. It's going to be fast. It's going to be easy. If they say that's not acceptable, then I have to fall back to how am I going to deal with these older browsers or devices. And in that case, they have shims and polyfills, which are basically JavaScript files that implement things for you because the native browser or device doesn't support it. So I'm going to show you Canvas later. That's a good example of somebody went out and said, I like what Canvas does. I apparently have enough free time to go recreate Canvas running on old versions of IE. So he implemented like 80 or 90% of what you get from Canvas, he actually has in the polyfill. So if I find out that you're IE and you don't support it, I can go get his JavaScript file, and then I'll still have that support even back to old versions of the browser. Okay? So I'll show you an example of how you can do that with Modernizer. So in this case, I want to take advantage of placeholders. So in HTML5, you have watermarks. You can put in your input boxes so people know what they have to type. So if we go, you can see the email address, and when I click in that, that goes away. So that's the type of support I want that happens to be built into HTML5 using a placeholder. So what I can do now is I can use Modernizer, and I can say, I want to test and see whether or not placeholder is something that's already supported by this given device or user agent. If it is, that's fine. If not, I think that's kind of funny. Nope, it's not supported. All right. Well, then I need to do my fallback and get the polyfill that I want to use. So in this case, I can get the watermark support using this placeholder. So typical jQuery, I use a lot of jQuery on our website too. I've got all these old plugins I've been using for years to support doing cross-browser stuff. This allows me to move forward, take advantage of HTML5 for the devices it works for, and yet still fall back and use the plugin that I used before. And the reason I like this approach is if we go, I'll pull it up in Fiddler. I assume most people have seen Fiddler in here. So it's going to watch the conversation between the browser and the server. So if I run this the first time, it looks like I'm in compatibility mode. So what it did is it came and said, I'm going to get the HTML page, I'm going to get Modernizer. Modernizer went down to the client, ran, and said, you know what? This right now in compatibility mode doesn't support the placeholder for HTML5. Therefore, go get the jQuery core library and go get the specific plugin I need to be able to get that functionality to work. If I turn this around and put this back in normal mode and look again, you'll see this is really what I want. I want to use Modernizer, I want to look for the features. If it's a modern browser, I want to use the HTML5 and CSS3 features. It's going to perform better. It's just going to work a lot more cleanly. So that's some of the polyfills. And again, a lot of these, I gave you a list here. Paul Irish, if you know him from Chrome, he does a lot of work on keeping a list of polyfills. So if there's something that you're looking for that you for some reason need support for back to IE7, for instance, or IE6, that list has a lot of good polyfills that you can fall back to. So any questions so far? I'm going to start getting into some of the HTML5 stuff.
Got a question on modelizer.
Yes?
You added those classes to your elements.
Yes.
Sorry, you have to specify that the classes to check
Yes.
for video, so
Yep.
no video. Does that mean you have to, I assume, that means you have to be not using those classes elsewhere in your code?
Yes. Yes. So I don't know why he didn't prefix. I don't know why Modernizer didn't do some sort of prefix, because the names they chose to me
That
seem
seems
pretty
very
common.
vague.
They seem pretty common to me.
Yeah.
I have not looked yet whether there's a lot of the tools like that now that support data dash attributes from HTML5. So a lot of the different plugins I get and stuff support both mechanisms. I wouldn't be surprised if they are aware of that, and you can set something on it that says prefix it with data dash, MDRZ or whatever for Modernizer. I just honestly haven't looked. But yeah, they pick very common names, so I would think you'd run into conflicts otherwise. So, any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, with Modernizer, you said it fixed the HTML and
It fixed the structure tags. Yeah.
Is that that's a minified? But does it mean that it doesn't matter what feature you select, the minified will do that kind of fix?
Yeah, so whether or not I configured and did the build, I just picked video or not, that basics supporting the structure tags would be there either way. And it won't matter if I do minified or not. I always personally do minified in production just because I want it to be faster. But it'll do that either way. Anything else? So what I tried to do is I've got full talks on HTML5, CSS3. I tried to pull out the parts that make sense for what have they done in these two technologies that you specifically will have a lot of advantages to when you do a mobile website compared to just other stuff. So I'm not going to cover the generic HTML5 stuff. I picked out the stuff that makes a difference when you're doing mobile, and they've improved our situation by having HTML5 be around. So the first one is there are new input types. So input type of email, URL, telephone, search, range, numbers, all that kind of stuff, date, time. So if we look at what that looks like, oops. All I need to do is specify these new types. So on the desktop, it's actually got pretty poor support right now, so I'll show you the Chrome version. Chrome's got pretty decent support. I've got a slider, I've got a drop-down calendar. The good thing about these, by the way, is because they're built into Chrome, as users use Chrome all the time, if I use these input types, they get familiar with what should a calendar look like, what should a color box look like, that kind of stuff, because they get that consistently across. My designers don't necessarily love it, because they want to control. I want it to look this, we're trying to break them of, it has to look this way on all of these different browsers and all of these different devices, but that's an interesting journey. In the case of IE, it's not supported almost at all. So you see, but the nice thing is it falls back automatically to still be a text box, so I haven't really lost anything. Why I like it for mobile in particular is I just pull up a date here. Because the mobile devices are a lot further along than the desktop browsers are about understanding these, they're very smart about taking advantage of, I don't think I have a soft key one here. Your keyboard, when it knows that it's an email, and you probably noticed this on sites that you're happy about and sites you're not happy about. If you specify that it's an email, the keyboard soft keys change to be specific for email, so it's easy for you to add. Or if it's a telephone number, all those sort of things, they can really customize the keyboard on mobile, and they do. So if you take advantage of these, you're not really losing anything. From a desktop perspective, they might look different, they might not. But the advantage really on mobile devices is they can be a lot smarter about their keyboard configurations if you give them these kind of hints when they do your input boxes. Okay. Next one we'll talk about is the canvas. So we're a food site, so I don't have a lot of need for doing a lot of drawing and stuff, but when you move to mobile devices, Jobs had said very earlier we're not going to support Flash, so we needed some other techniques to be able to do some drawing on mobile devices that would work. And the canvas is basically a rectangular area where if you've taken computer graphics in university, you got to draw all the circles and you're back. You get to do that stuff again if you want. So right now, they're focusing on 2D versions of it, but you can do text, you can do gradients, you can respond to events. I'm going to show you people have written full games using Canvas. Problem is there's no DOM access, so there's no way for you to reach into the DOM and do this. And it's not the same as SVG drawing, where if you change the scene with Canvas, you end up redrawing everything all over again. But I want to show you a really simple, ugly one that I made, and then I'll show you some cool examples that other people made. So for Canvas, again, I'm going to do, here's my Canvas tag. That just defines how big the area is I want to draw in. And they made the tag automatically support a fallback, so to speak. So in my case, the fallback here would be I don't need to use Modernizer. The stuff I put in between the canvas would be the fallback if Canvas isn't supported by that particular device. In this case, I say, sorry, it doesn't work. What I need to do is I get a hold of that canvas area, I get a canvas context, and then I start doing all of the, here's drawing a rectangle, here's how you draw some text in a certain font and a certain color. So if we look at what this looks like on the screen, oh, isn't that beautiful? You can have stuff go off the edge of the canvas, you can do the layering that you want to do, but I mean, this is not a very entertaining way from my perspective. Thankfully, I don't have to do a lot of this, but to do client-side drawing. But the nice thing is it is something that's supported by a lot of devices. So I'll show you some much better examples. So it has sound and everything. I won't pick up all the sound just to get this to work, but we've got Pac-Man, we've got Angry Birds. And you can see we'll talk about offline apps later, but they actually have the ability for me to install this offline using the application cache. I won't bother to sit here and wait for it to run. It runs just like you expect an Angry Bird to run as. They also have, those of us old enough to remember all of the old Atari games, so they've got Lunar Lander and all that stuff. So somebody really spent a lot of time doing this. So take advantage of it, right? You're doing research at work someday. So that's the canvas. Next one is HTML5 video. So I was pretty excited when I heard video was going to be built in. I thought that's really cool. I don't have to do the plugin. It's got a basic video tag, so it has, I can set whether I want to use built-in browser controls. So again, if I want to use what's built into Chrome, that Chrome users will be used to, I can just use the native controls that are available in Chrome. I can also create my own if I need to, so if my designer says it has to look this way everywhere, I can create my own controls for them. I can set to preload. You can set to autoplay, but if you do, I'll find you. There's a poster attribute, so I can actually specify which image out of that video frame I want to have be the one in place before the video plays. And then the way it deals with, so the good news, right, you have a video tag. The bad news, and it's a standard, the bad news is the browser vendors did not agree on the codecs to use for how you encode your videos. And so the way you deal with it is it's got a source. I list a number of sources in different video formats, and then what the browser will do is it will pick the first one it understands. It'll only download the one that it understands, which is good. And then it'll play it in that order, and then if it doesn't find any, it'll fall back again, and I can do whatever I need to do, whether I use jQuery. In the past, we'd always use jQuery to do all of our videos, so we use like Flow Player and some of those, and it worked pretty well across browsers, so I could fall back to that if I wanted to. I need to serve video files with the proper MIME type, so just be aware, when I did this, I created all the different encoding versions I wanted. IIS did not know about many of them, so I had to actually go into IIS. We've had to do this before, but I have to go into IIS and set the MIME types. So I have to go find the particular, and I think it was OGG is the one that I was, right here. This was not defined. So what would happen is you'd go to your page and it wouldn't work. And I'd use Fiddler and it would say 404. And it would say 404 because IIS thought it was a good idea to start lying to you for security reasons, right? The file's there and it'll really tick you off because you can see the file. It'll say it's not found, and if you look at the substatus code, it'll actually say you didn't turn on that MIME type because IIS just won't serve just any old file. You have to actually tell it, I'll make a MIME type, that means it's okay for you to serve. So just be aware as you do a lot of these different encodings. A lot of the friend ones aren't going to be in here, so you got to find out the right MIME type and define it in here. It's not going to play. So let's look at what that looks like. If you thought my canvas was good, you would like this. So here's my video tag. Again, I can specify the sources. So I'm just going to list out in order all the different encodings that I did. And then eventually I can have a fallback if I want to jQuery or sorry, your browser doesn't handle this. Let's pull this up in IE. I just get an invalid source. None of the sources that I did were compatible with IE. If I do this in Chrome, isn't that beautiful? I'm a filmmaker. That's my clock. Oh, you can make it, sorry. It was late, so someone did it. So again, I can use the built-in controls. I can create my own controls. So I was really excited about HTML5 video. I'm glad that it's going to work across all these devices. Do I actually use it? I don't. We actually decided a while back, we just went with YouTube. We let them spend the money on the bandwidth. They deal with the different devices. Basically, we did not want to have to go and code our videos 5 or 6 times or whatever we had to do to get it to work everywhere. So we just punted, started hosting it on YouTube instead. So be aware it's here. If you're willing to do the multiple encodings, great. It's an easy tag to embed and it'll work across a lot of the devices. Okay. Next one is web storage. So if you've used cookies in the past, there's a couple problems with cookies. Every time you store something in a cookie, it gets sent back to your server with every request. So if you start storing a lot of data, every request to that same domain sends that cookie along with it. So you're just sending a lot of data you might not need. You also have size limitations. So what they came up with, they started working on kind of 2 things. I'm going to talk about web storage. They've also worked on having SQL databases available on the client. If you think getting video formats agreed to across all the vendors was hard, picking the SQL server that everybody was going to have made available as the standard kind of SQL database, so that fizzled pretty quickly. So I mean, they've tried to work on that with IndexedDB. They had web SQL for a while. At this point, web storage is probably the best choice for storing stuff on the client when it's small amounts of information. And it's going to be a key value pair that's a string. So anything I can serialize into a string, I can store locally in the web storage. There's 2 types. There's local storage, which is going to live forever. I mean, it's going to get stored in the local device. There's a 5 meg limit as how much I can store in there from my domain. Or I can store stuff session stored. So if I only need this data for this particular session, but I want it on the client so I don't have to keep going to get it all the time, I can take advantage of that session storage. It does have same domain origin restrictions, which just means the only person who can look at this data from code is somebody that's coming from the same domain who issued it. That's the way they try to secure it. Don't count on that. I mean, don't store credit cards in local storage. It's on the disk. People can get to these things. The point is, they have some simple restrictions in place to try to stop people from poking and seeing your stuff. They use the same domain restrictions. So let's take a look at what the web storage looks like. So I've got 2 buttons on here. One's going to set some values, one's going to get them. And I just wanted to show using local storage versus session storage. Again, where I get this data, I do a lot of jQuery AJAX calls to my web server to get data, JSON format, whatever. I can go get data when I start a session. As long as it's a string, I can put it into local storage. So you can imagine going and get a list of products or something from your server that are current and use that to write out. I just wanted to show you some simple examples. So I'm writing out my name and a number. When I go to do a get, it's just going to pull those 2 things out. So this will do what you expect. I can set the values, I can get them. Both of these will be present right now because I've got my session is still active. If I come back again, it does what you'd expect. It has the name because I stored that in local storage. The stuff I put in session storage went away, so that's not going to be available anymore. But where we're going to take advantage of this is we're going to start talking about offline web apps, the capability to run disconnected. And when you're disconnected, you're going to want to be able to take advantage of storing stuff locally. So for instance, if I did this, I'm on the mobile phone, I have a connection, I'm working on the website, I want to place an order now, I'm suddenly not connected. I could write code to store the order locally on the device, And then there's going to be events to tell me I'm connected or I'm not connected, I've gained a connection or not. So then I can use jQuery and sync that back to my server and complete the actual order. Okay? So that's why this is interesting. So we'll talk about that, the HTML5 offline web applications. A little strange from what I expected to what it had. So it's got what's called a manifest file, and the manifest files are going to allow me to say, here's the files that I want you to store locally on either the desktop or on a mobile device, so that when you're offline, I have access to these resources. Okay? So the thing that I expected, if I were to create the manifest file, I'd say, here's a page that I want to have available when I'm offline. I expected that it was going to go get all the stuff that page uses, all the images, all the JavaScript, all the CSS. Isn't what it does, which is kind of annoying. So what I have to actually do is I need to specify in my manifest file all of the resources that I want to pull down. And I'll show you an example of how that works. And then again, there's a property here at the bottom. This is how I can tell if I'm online or not. And it actually fires events for me as well. Like when I lose or gain a connection, I can find that out. So let's look at a simple app caching. So I have a page, and what it does is I specify the manifest up top here. So first I'm going to go back and just put the demo one. When I first started, what I wanted is I've got these two other pages, A and B, that I want available on the client when I'm not connected. So I went into this manifest and said, please give me A.html and B.html. And like I said, I expected it to get all the auxiliary files. So if I actually run this with Fiddler, I'll show you this out. So it says it populated that. So you can see what it went and did. It went and got the page. It got my manifest file. By the way, manifests are also something that are defined, I won't say incorrectly. IIS already had a definition for the manifest files. So you've got to go change it. I think I listed it in this line. You've got to go change .manifest to be this if you want this to work and you're using IIS, which is something to be aware of. So come back and look at Fiddler. It went, and then it went and got the two pages I want, but you notice it didn't go get any of the auxiliary files. So if I look in A.html, this uses jQuery, it has a style link, it has some images in it. I wanted all that stuff to be offloaded, so it kind of sucks, because now I'm going to maintain this in two places, right? I got to do it in my manifest file. And there's some tools and stuff you can find that help you generate manifest files that do some of that crawling and stuff for you, so it's not an impossible thing. But the point is, it isn't exactly what I expected it to do. If I go back, I'm going to specify the complete. So if I save that, what's in this complete one instead, I put in a few more examples. And I like to put them in the order that they are. So here's A.html. It requires that style sheet, that JavaScript, that image. B.html. I also downloaded an offline app or page, and you can specify fallbacks. So you can say, if I'm online, somebody links to C.html, I want you to show me that. However, if I'm not connected, fall back and show me the offline version of this page. So you can kind of have two versions. You can have the offline one in their cache, or you can have a generic page on the client that said, sorry, you're not connected right now, I can't show you that. You can give them one good page and point to all of your fallback files to that one page so they get a good message. Does that make sense? So if we run this again, let me play this out. And now you can see it does what you expect. It brings down those additional files and things. And like I said, there are tools that can help you generate this. So you don't have to do that all by hand, but you do have to realize that by default, it's not interpreting your HTML page and actually going and pulling all the resources for you. But this is a key capability of why mobile websites are actually capable to run on devices and take advantage of that is because if you lose my voice, sorry. If you have a lot of users that are disconnected and you choose to support this, this is something that just was very difficult to do before. that now HTML5 at least gives me a pathway to take advantage of this. Do I do this on most of my sites? I honestly don't. I mean, if you're looking for pizza and you happen to be out of range in the middle of nowhere, you're going to drive a long way to a store anyways. And you're halfway there, you'll be able to figure out where I sell, right? It's not worth the effort for us to go through all the effort of doing the offline apps for our entire website. So I typically don't do it. But if you are in the type of environment where they really need access to stuff, offline web apps can make a lot of sense. Okay. We talked about the manifest file. So let's talk about geolocation. So this is another cool thing. You can use it on desktops. It's primarily useful when you do mobile devices. So if you're aware, the Google Street View that drives around, I assume that does that here as well, right? It actually came through our town. We have like 10,000 people, and I saw it go. You guys are really low on the totem pole looking if you're going through our town. But they weren't just taking pictures of all the street views, they were stealing all of your wireless access point information as well. And where they use that is they use it for geolocation. So they'll figure out, depending on what your device is, obviously if you have a smartphone, it can use the built-in GPS. That's going to be very accurate. Otherwise, if you're on a desktop, it can look at all sorts of stuff. Your IP address, what wireless network, I mean, any of that kind of stuff it uses to try to pinpoint where you are. The user has to opt in, so if you ask for geolocation, it's going to pop in whatever device or browser. It's going to say, if you allow somebody to have your location, you've probably seen this a lot of times before. You say, yes, go ahead. Typically, they're going to do this get current position. That's just going to try to determine where I am right now. Be aware that they can also watch your position. So if you say yes, they can actually be trailing you. I mean, they can see as you move, so they can take advantage of movement as well, as long as you've got your page and stuff available. So let's look at geolocation. So here's get current position. So all I'm going to do is when I hit this button, I'm going to call get location. I'm going to ask for the position. That's going to prompt me in my device whether or not I want to allow access. So I will, to make it an exciting demonstration, I'll say yes. And then I'll go map this and see how close this is. Let's zoom in here. That's pretty good. I don't know how close that is to exactly where we are in the Methodist Central Hall, but so I mean the geolocation works pretty well, and we do use it as a convenience for our customers, especially on mobile. A lot of times they'll be traveling, they don't know, they really want one of our pizzas, right? But they don't know the zip code they're in, which they're driving somewhere else. Using the get current position is really pretty useful for us, so we can pinpoint about where they are, and we can tell them stores that are near them that sell our products. And again, that's pretty straightforward to use. I've got some error handling in there if they say they don't want to share their location. But that is geolocation. So that's kind of the HTML5 things that are useful for doing mobile websites. I've got a couple CSS3 ones, and then I'm going to touch on responsive design, MDOT sites, different techniques you can use for handling images, all that kind of stuff. So CSS3, instead of being one big specification, they actually broke it up into a series of modules. And they did that just so they could get it implemented faster. So some of the things are moving faster than others. And again, this is why I don't care that all of CSS3 is done. I care if a given feature like border radius is well supported. That's good enough for me. As soon as you start doing a lot of CSS3 things, you're going to run into browser or vendor prefixes, right? If you've seen these before, a lot of these properties, and the problem was browser vendors wanted to start using this, even though the standard wasn't done. So the properties that they use, they have prefixed with these vendor prefixes. So if Chrome decided to implement, say, border radius a long time ago, they could do WebKit-border radius. And then only the WebKit type of browsers would actually know how to interpret that and use that. So as we go through, you'll see some of the techniques we're going to use are not implemented everywhere yet, so they've got these browser prefixes. Are they evil? Not really. I mean, they are what they are. I hope that someday they will be standardized. Sorry. Eventually, whatever the feature is will actually be standardized, so you won't need the browser prefixes anymore and you can take them off. But if you see them, that's why they're there. So one of the things that's kind of cool is if you want to start doing more animations, we talked about Canvas for drawing pictures. CSS3 has the ability to do transitions. So you can have kind of a start state and an end state, and you can have a smooth transition between where you were and where you want to go. The only odd thing about this was you specify the properties that are going to change on where you're coming from, not where you're going to, which was kind of opposite of what I expected. So if you look at these. So I've got a box as I hover. Oh, I'm on IE. Doesn't support transitions. Sorry. Do that in Chrome. So you saw there I had the begin case and the end case. Here you'll see that I'm able to do all sorts of animations. And the reason I like these is that these are things most of my designers don't know how to write code. But they do know how to do styles. They do know how to do animations and things that they can take advantage of in CSS3 to add these kind of capabilities without having a developer have to do these kind of things. So if we look at what this looks like again, it started as a red box. It's going to become a blue box. And I put the properties that I want to transition onto the from, not the to. So on the from, I say, I want to change the background color. I want it to start right away, and I want it to finish within 3 seconds. So it's going to finish its red to blue transition in 3 seconds without a delay. And then you can see the other ones. It just plays with the loading time. But when people who are good at these kind of things use these techniques, they can get really nice, smooth transitions between things, just leveraging what's built into CSS. Okay. There's also 2D transforms. So this is the ability, if you remember your, I guess mine was linear algebra, where you had matrices and how you can do matrix work on transforms. So you can do scales and rotations. So they do have 3D. Some people are working on 3D versions of transforms as well. You can see this is a WebKit specific thing at this point, but I can take images down below. I can scale them down. By the way, if you went to my bird talk, don't ever do this. Right? This is an example. Don't scale down. Don't download a big image and make it smaller. You can do rotations. You can do translations. So if I run this, so you can see you get all these. You can see it doesn't move the existing content, which may be useful or not useful. You can see how the skew has layered on top of some of my other content. But just the ability to transform, slide, move, scale, do things with elements on the client, again, is useful in CSS3. The big one from a mobile perspective is really media queries. So media queries are going to be the foundation when we talk about doing responsive design. Media queries, you've had media for a long time. So in CSS2, we had media print. So what I did, we're a food website. You come out, you look at the food, you say, oh, that's a cool recipe. I want to print a recipe card, right? You don't want to have the whole web page print. I could just specify that I want media print, and I could hide the header, the footer. I mean, it only took like a half hour. I hid all the elements I didn't want to see. I reshaped it to fit a standard recipe index card. And then when they do their print, it's going to fit on, so they can cut it out, put it on a recipe card, pretty straightforward. What CSS3 lets me do is I can interrogate a lot more about the device. So I can ask it, what's your width and height? The width is the primary thing that your responsive grids use. So they're going to look and say, are you a smartphone or a tablet or a desktop or a TV size? They look at the width using media queries. And then they can write different styles to hide and show things based on the width that they determine using a media query. So I'm going to show you how that works. It also has color, it has resolution, it has orientation, whether you're portrait or landscape. Those are all things that media queries can detect on the client using styles, and they can behave differently. So this will be one of the foundational things when we get to responsive. So my example is really simple. I've got, if you're on the screen, I want you to be the color blue. If you happen to be between 900 pixels and 1024, make it yellow. I mean, just kind of a simple example of, based on the client and what it determines, and you can see down here, I've also got portrait or landscape. It's going to change the color as I resize the browser. And the nice thing is it keeps doing it, it's dynamic, right? We'll keep doing this as I resize. Every time I'm resizing the browser, the media queries are going to rerun and figure out, oh, this is the size I'm at, now I've got to do all this different stuff on the fly. Okay? So I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that. As I said, the responsive stuff is going to take advantage of that. A couple last minute mobile best practices just from a web standpoint. There is a way to put a link in your web pages so someone will actually dial when they dial on their phone. So if you do a hyperlink and use TEL and you can specify the phone number, when they click that link, it will actually do the dial form on your phone. So if you've been to a lot of websites where it says you want to call us right now and you hit that, it's because they're doing that. So it'll actually start the call for you. And same thing for text messages. If you put that SMS colon, when they click on that, it's actually going to open. So I'll show you what it looked like on my iPhone. Or actually, it's my Android one. I didn't want to carry a camera on a million devices, so this would be a little easier. So here's where I tap the SMS. You can see where it fills in who it's going to, and then it immediately puts me in a place where now I can start to type a text. And the same idea with the telephone. It puts in who it's going to call, and I'm ready to hit call at that point to finish the call. So they're just little things you can add into your page that make that easier on mobile devices. Consider carefully whether you make it look like a specific native app platform. So one of the things people say is, well, you're going to do a website, make it look like it's an iPhone. Well, I really don't want to do that, right? Because then when it's on all of the other devices I support, it's going to look like it's iOS. So I focused instead, we tried to work on, let's have our website be branded with our website, right? And this is our site, our colors, let's use that. People know how to use browsers, right? People also know if they're on their phone and you don't have an app, they can go to your website. And then, so I don't spend a lot of time trying to make it look like a specific native app platform or a specific native app. I'm trying to get the people to accomplish the task that they want to accomplish on that device successfully via a website. Okay? Some features you need to watch out for. So we're an e-commerce site. We've been running a website forever. As we transitioned, people started getting iPads and tablets and stuff. We lucked out that somehow we knew the exact fixed width to use that an iPad would have. So when the iPads came out, our site pretty much totally worked, other than we had one place where we did drag and drop. So just be aware the drag and drop isn't going to function well on a touch device. So we had to come up with something for that. Hover doesn't work as well. Video, audio formats you have to consider for these different devices. Obviously, you won't have Flash available. We didn't do a lot of Flash before, but just some things you want to know. Talk a little bit about viewports. So the idea with the viewport is, by default, on a smartphone, the browsers assume a certain width. So they say, I don't know that your site's been optimized, so I'm going to pick a certain width to display your page at and listed what the defaults are up there. I can override that default by setting a viewport. It may make sense for you, it may not. So I don't do this on my website. When you come to my site, you actually get a view of what I've designed for fitting inside the complete window scaled out. And I'll show you what I mean by, I'll show you the canvas example. So I showed you the canvas before. By default, this is what it would look like on my phone. I've got a web page. I only said it was supposed to be a portion of the web page I was using. So when I pulled it up on my Android, it just said, all right, I'm going to fit the whole page on my screen, and I'm going to zoom out so you can see that. In this case, I'm not really taking advantage of the rest of that screen. If I go set that viewport, I set it to be the device width. Now the device width equals what I'm displaying. So if my content in this case happens to be a little bit bigger, I miss a little of it. But it might be for my website, I want to be already zoomed in like this. Depends on what I designed for, right? So if you want to do that, there's a lot of capabilities in the viewport, but you can just set the width equal to device width. You can control whether people can pinch and zoom and all that stuff from the viewport as well. You can specify they can't scale, and so if you want them. I've done that before when I needed to make something. Despite my objections, on an internal app, they said you have to make it look like an iPad native app. And so I actually played with that and said, I don't want you to pinch and zoom because I want it to look like it's a fixed native size. So I've actually done that before to give you the work. Okay, so now I'm kind of leaving the HTML5, CSS3. I'm going to start talking about general mobile stuff. Obviously, in a talk of this length, I'm not going to be able to get into everything. So I want to give you kind of the high-level view about what your choices are. And then I'm going to show you some specific examples of different techniques you could use. So mobile first has become a lot more popular lately. I know why. The reason is because if you went to my marketing group, I've tried this. You already have a desktop site, and you go to a group of marketing people and say, tell me what I can take off to make it fit on a phone. I'll see you in like 3 years, because they're going to argue about it. If I go the other way, which is you have a phone, you have this amount of space. What's important to put on that? They tell you that. Great, awesome, put that aside. Now you have a tablet. You got a little extra. You can put in some of your little marketing stuff over here, right? And then as you move up to desktop, so the approach of saying, let's start with the most constrained, restricted environment first is just a much easier conversation with both your business people and your tech people as well. So you just, the idea is just from a philosophical how you go through, start with the small and move up and add stuff rather than trying to go the other way or you probably won't succeed. Realistically, this is only going to work for me on a brand new site, right? Otherwise, I got the problem I already have. I have a desktop one and I have to tell them when you're going to take off, and that just doesn't generally work. But on a starting from scratch one, that's the way I would prefer to start with. Show me the small and move up. I give you a link that goes into some of the, I've got links to kind of the seminal articles about these particular things, so this is one on mobile first. The other big debate you get into for the websites then is, are you going to try to do what some people call one web, or are you going to do separate sites? And so the idea is, there's one camp that says, no matter what device you're on, you should come to a single URL, and that thing should adapt itself based on your device to show you what's appropriate. So the responsive people fall in the one web camp. They don't want to have different URLs. No matter where you come from, whatever your device is, we're going to try to show you something appropriate for this device. The alternative is setting up separate sites. So if you've seen, a lot of people used to have M.dot sites, so they'll have them, not used to, people still do. You create a site that's specifically made for a smartphone, and you can have it be M.dot or whatever URL, but it can be completely different than your normal site. So those are kind of the two camps, and the main arguments are, you know, from a responsive, everybody gets kind of the same basic stuff. It's one set of code, it's easier to maintain. On the other side, they say, well, that's interesting, but the example they've given me is if you go to a university's website, it's going to have all sorts of stuff, right? Athletics, academics, all this kind of stuff. If you're coming at it from a phone, they argue, you might be on campus. So they're going to use the context of where you are to take advantage of showing you specific things that matter to you when you're on a smartphone, assuming you can go back to your desktop later to read about all the fraternities or something else. And so they argue it's a totally different experience when you're on a device. Make it work really well for that device. Don't try to shoehorn all of it to fit on all these different devices. So I've looked at this both different ways for our sites. When we had to redo our whole e-commerce site for mobile, and I was given a nice tight deadline, I was leaning more towards doing an M.dot site, because switching my entire site to be responsive was a huge undertaking. There's no way I'd get it done in any time soon. However, I could make an M.dot site specifically targeted just to certain use cases very quickly. So there's not really a right or wrong answer. It kind of depends on your projects, your budget, your timelines, all that other stuff, which one makes more sense for you. And there's, if you follow these links, there's very vehement arguments from one camp versus the other. So you can kind of read and get your own feeling for which one of those makes sense. I've done both. I've got some of our branded sites. We just finished a responsive one using Bootstrap 3, and that's been very successful. I liked it. I lean that way. I'm kind of a purist. I like the idea of having one code base, one URL, everything just magically fits everywhere. But I've also gone where we've done a separate site because timelines and stuff dictated, or we wanted to do something specific on the phone version versus the desktop, right? I didn't want to just change how it looked. I wanted it to be basically completely different. That's where a separate site can make sense. Talk a little bit about device identification. So I told you earlier I don't like to do device detection. Generally that's true. I want to do feature detection. There's times where that just isn't true anymore. So for instance, you come to my desktop site, we developed an app. I need to, hopefully marketing, let me see this video. I have to annoy you by telling you, you can go download the app every time you come to my website, right? So to do that, I need to detect and figure out that you're a smartphone or not. And so there's lots of different ways to do that. 51 degrees, Wurfel. I went out and saw Wurfel now has a JavaScript version, if you're familiar with what Wurfel is. But the JavaScript one was kind of intriguing because you don't have to host a local database and keep it updated with all the device data. You can actually just use their JavaScript file. That request goes out to their servers. They have the database already. Then they come back with some of the capabilities, albeit not a lot. I mean, that's the negative of this. It doesn't tell me a lot about the capabilities of that device, but it does tell me, am I a smartphone, that kind of stuff, which is maybe all that I need from a client perspective. And it also matters, do I care on the server or the client? So we'll talk about some examples of that. I've used this detectmobilebrowsers.com, free, easy, and relatively correct, which was good enough for what I wanted to do. Warning people that have an app and you can go get it. And I'll show you, I have an example of that in here. Also device address. So these are all kind of on a spectrum of how much do you want to pay. And when you talk 51 degrees and those kinds, they have very extensive databases based on here are all the user agents of all these devices. And they give you everything they know about that device. So if you need to know a lot of details about exactly what this device supports, you might want to go further on that end of the spectrum, but again, those are things that you have to pay for, so it depends on what you need. To just identify their smartphone, to send them to a mobile site or do things like that. The basic device identification stuff works pretty well. Again, you have access to all this code, so I'll just kind of pop in here and show you a couple things, but I wanted to start with doing some server-side detection. So I'm going to do some of the device detection in this one. And I'm going to modify this page from the server perspective. Okay? So if I show you what this looks like. So I went to Australia. If you ever go there, you can actually walk up and down that bridge there, which is kind of cool. I found out my dad's afraid of heights that day. He told me he already paid. So what I can do now is I can detect down below here, if based on server side, I can look and detect what you are, and I can either make that be 3 columns, or I can shrink it down to be 1 if you're a smartphone, okay? And again, in this case, what I did, I have this is mobile device, and we can look at what that thing looks like. It uses that detect mobile browser script, and it's just looking for certain things that it knows to look for, like iPad, iPhone, Android. It's giving me a very basic, I'm mobile or I'm a desktop. In some cases, this is enough. And I just go out and periodically get this updated. So I've kind of got a spectrum right now. I've used this on the low end. I've used some of the other ones in the middle. Responsive, I've done more on the client. But I just wanted you to be aware that there are a number of different ways you can identify. And sometimes you'll use it for both responsive and for MDOT sites. So we'll talk about responsive web design in this. It's an implementation to me of OneWeb. So it's the perspective of I want to hit with your URL. I want you to adapt yourself based on what my device looks like. There's really 3 key components to how this works. Fluid grids. So that's the grid system that you create all of your content in. That gets modified automatically as you get to a tablet or a smartphone. The grid itself knows how to relay itself out to make everything fit for that device. Fluid images is just the ability to download the right images for your device. So you don't want to download huge images for desktop. Even though it's on a small mobile device, you're just going to kill yourself as far as speed, especially on 3G. So there's different techniques for doing images I'll show you, and then we talked about media queries are really the underlying part of how responsive functions. Okay? I spoke about, I've used Bootstrap 3. I've used Zerb Foundation, which is an example I have in here that I'll show you. So first I'll show you kind of an in-betweener. If I wanted to do responsive myself, In other words, I don't want to use a foundation. I'll show you kind of how you can do that manually. So first you'll see, I'm going to create different style sheets for my content. I've got one that's a desktop, one that's a smartphone. The media queries will allow me to say, if you're between this width and this width, I want you to get the desktop CSS. And in there, I show everything, right? I set the sizes to be what I want for fixed. In the phone one, I can say, maybe this top part, I don't even need to show on the phone, so I can just say display none. Whatever I need to do in these style sheets to accommodate my two different designs, kind of for desktop and for phone. I didn't do a tablet version of that. The bad news about this, and one of the knocks of responsive, is performance. And unfortunately, when I pull this up, I'll show you. Anybody want to guess what will happen? Nothing, because it's cached. Awesome. Okay, if you come in here, what you'll notice is that it actually downloads both of the styles. Okay? Because the media queries are not smart enough to know, they should know their current size, and I would have thought they'd get the right one. And I think what their argument was is, well, as you get resizing, we'd have to go make a request then, and there'd be a delay. First of all, normal customers don't sit here resizing their browser all the time. I mean, that's what we do when we're testing. Normal people don't do that. But anyway, so they download both of those, which is kind of unfortunate. I've got a piece of code in here for, this is what I use for doing image manipulation, for choosing the right one. I'm going to show you different examples, but this is one way to do it. I include, so I have an image here. What I do is I set the source originally to be a small 1 by 1 pixel image so that no matter who you are, you're not going to get penalized. You're going to have a super small image. On the client then, I'm going to look at your width. So I'm going to look and say, if your width is greater than 900, you should be desktop. Well, inside that image tag, I put two other things. I put in, if you've seen data dash attributes before for HTML5, they get ignored by browsers, but I can use them in client-side script. So I point to the small version of the image using data dash small. I point to the large using data dash large. And then my jQuery, once it gets to the client, says, go set use data dash large and change all of my image sources to pull from that attribute. And so I get just the large ones when I'm a desktop. I get the same thing on a smartphone, I only get the small ones. Other techniques you'll see, people will say, start with the small and then go get the large if you need it. Well, then my desktop people are downloading too much. Yeah, you kind of lose either way, so I prefer doing I'll do that 1 pixel, and I'm going to go pull the exact one I need from a client perspective. Does that make sense? So that's one way to do it. The other way that I put in here, just so you can see, is if I want to, I can call a handler on the server. So if you see this one, I get the source for the image by calling a server-side handler. In that handler, I'm going to use server-side detection, so I can do that, right? I mean, I can look on the server and say, your smartphone, I'm going to give you the right attribute to be small. I can also do that on the server. So I've got examples in here of server-side. I figure out that you're a phone. I'm going to set the image attribute on the server, so I don't have to go back and talk to it to get it. It's going to come down the right way because I'm taking advantage of that from the server perspective. So if I go back now for the other responsive, so again, this is Zerb. I've used that. I've used Bootstrap 3. It gives me a CSS style sheet to do some of the media queries that I need. And then what I end up doing, if I can come down here, I end up creating rows and columns. So all of these grid systems break your page up into a series of columns. And then all I need to do is decide if I'm desktop and I want to have 3, I showed you how I have 3 columns worth of stuff down here. That's my design. Then I'll say out of the 12, I want 4 columns to be used for this data. And in there I drop an individual image. So I've carved up that 12 into sets of 4, therefore I end up with 3. When you resize this and make that smaller, it automatically gets adjusted by your grid to show the stuff now in 1 column instead of 3. That's what you get from grid systems. Does that make sense? So the other thing that's changed a lot, even a year ago when I was talking to our business people about how should we redo our e-commerce site, should we do responsive, should we not? Back then there really weren't good examples of responsive e-commerce sites. The Boston Globe was out there, lots of other sites like that, but I couldn't find a lot of examples of an e-commerce site that actually did responsive. Now, Starbucks is doing it, Skinny Ties is kind of one of the premier examples of that. I like this particular site. If I can type it right. It's been very helpful when we talk with our designers and stuff. They show an example of the different design breakpoints and what they would look like. So you can see for a lot of these different sites, what do they do when they go from here to here? Sometimes they drop the image. A lot of them take their menus that go across the top, split them down. Some of them do the hamburger menu, that kind of stuff. But it's a great site to go look at for examples of how these design breakpoints look across. So it's just media queries, but the ES is after the dot. So that's the site. But it really helped us communicate with our designers and stuff about what the possibilities are for doing responsive and targeting different sizes. A newer thing people are talking about is REST. So it's really a responsive web design with server-side components, which I don't get too specific about this technique and I'm following exactly what they're saying. To me, it's the fact that I'm using the best of both, right? I'm going to use responsive if I want to do responsive design, but that doesn't mean I have to be stupid and download extra style sheets and stuff, right? I'll mix in some server-side detection. So if I were even smart enough on this one, go back to my adaptive example. Right here. I don't have to include both of these links, right? I could do some server-side detection and say, in the case of desktop, I'm only going to embed the link for desktop for the client. And that way I'm not going to get that double download. So I'm still getting all the benefits of responsive on the client. Now, the one caveat is if someone does start to do this kind of stuff, right, your designer, what I actually wrote is I wrote some client-side JavaScript that will fire. So they first asked me and said, well, I need you to still tailor this so it works when somebody does this. And I said, well, nobody does this, but unfortunately the testing people did, and they keep putting in defects. So what we did is we said we want a client-side way to know when you cross a design breakpoint in JavaScript. And so if you just capture the resize event for a browser, the bad news is every pixel as you move that sucker, that thing fires. That's not going to be efficient. So I actually had to write something that kept track of, I'm a desktop now. As I make it smaller, that resize event keeps firing. I don't care until I cross over the next design breakpoint, right? So I know that when I get to tablet size, then I need to do some JavaScript because I need to do, we use a lot of jQuery plugins and stuff, so although I did responsive, I was also following up with a lot of my own JavaScript where I had to go tailor stuff for the tablet version or for the phone version. So for instance, we put in one of those big Facebook light boxes on our homepage for the desktop. Right? On a phone, that thing was like more than a meg itself, just that component. So we can't afford, and you can't just use media queries and hide it. Right? Display none does nothing. It's still going to download all of this meg of stuff. So what we did is we actually had to write it so that as we were transitioning through the design breakpoints on the client, I purposely used the DOM to screw that thing up so it doesn't, I mean, effectively it won't download it when I get to the smartphone size. Yep?
Isn't it better to detect speed rather than size for that case?
So the question is, isn't it better to detect speed rather than size? I personally have not seen a lot of good libraries about connectivity, actually detecting what my current speed is. And that light box is also really wide. So even if the connectivity told me that I just don't have good enough connectivity to bring it down, they didn't want that in their design either way. So from a design standpoint, they don't want it. But yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I wish, and if somebody knows one, I'd love to hear it. A good library that does that, and I've seen people try writing JavaScript to download set sizes and do kind of what's your connection like right now. They don't incorporate that now in media queries. You know what I mean? Because that's where that would be helpful. If I could say, not only do I care about the width, but this thing is a hog that I don't want when I have a bad connection. That would be nice. I haven't seen any that actually do it. But okay. So anyways, from a REST perspective, the point is just you don't have to be blindly following just one approach. You can mix in and do some server-side detection and be smarter about how you transmit stuff to the client. I can still use a lot of responsive techniques without the penalties. Okay? So we talked about images. There's lots of different ways to do the images. I showed you, you can do a server-side handler, figure it out on the server and say, I know that you're a phone size, or I know that you're a tablet, therefore I'm just going to create the image with the right link in the first place. I showed you the small version replacing with the larger or small as appropriate. Large versions of images and scale down. We don't want to download something big and scale down, that's going to suck.
With that bit, as I say, we've got a large image and we scale it down, the compression stays as it is, doesn't it?
So the question was, so if I had a large version of an image and I download it,
Yeah,
and I did the compression stuff we talked about before.
yeah.
I took a JPEG and I made it a good size to be large. The compression still holds. I mean, none of that matters. And it'll look okay, because when you scale down, the browsers figure out how to make that look good. It's just you wasted the time downloading that large image. Now, there are times where, you know, if you look at my site and I look and say, somebody's already going to have this image in their cache anyways because they saw it. You know, you follow your flow. Maybe they already got a medium-sized version of this image. Later on, saying I'm going to go get a small is actually worse. But that makes a lot of assumptions, right? And which they might work for your site. If you know they already have one that's bigger, that's fine. If you know it's going to be in the cache, I don't mind you scaling it down. But most of the time, it's somebody makes their life easy and says, I have the big image. And then for all the different things like Retina, you know, for double size, all that kind of stuff, or for mobile, they just do the width height thing, take the shortcut, and then they wonder why this phone is so much slower than their desktop. That's a good reason why.
It's just the quality of the image, and when you compress it, the quality of the image, when it's absolutely...
Yeah, so when I talked about JPEG compression this morning, I was toying with a trade-off of the image quality versus the size, and getting it to a point where I thought it was going to be acceptable, where they couldn't visually see the difference, but I could still make it the size. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And you know, if you do that, maybe for you, if you compress it well enough that you can get by with saying it's not worth managing. I've got 6 versions of all my product images for various sizes from a performance standpoint. That's worth it to me to manage that and figure out the right one to get. So generally, I wouldn't scale it down. If that makes sense. We talked about the single pixel images, replacing with the right size. There are 2 new things they're working on as far as standards for having a standard way to approach this. Chrome version 34 has actually already implemented the source set. So I'll show you what this does briefly. They're going to play with the ability to set their image tag. So they're going to, instead of having a source, they'll have a source as a fallback in case your browser doesn't support source set. But you can lay out various sized. So they're trying to deal with the Retina, the higher pixel density displays, the various sizes based on width, and let the browser figure out the right one to get if you follow. So this is something they're recommending, and they're actually implementing now to get some feedback on how well this works. So source set is one of them. The other one is called picture fill. And this is also going through the standards process. I personally don't like this one because I think it's really verbose. But it looks kind of like, this guy, by the way, this is a polyfill. It's a way for you to run using what picture fill might end up like, but use it today from a JavaScript. So he's got an approximation, but it looks about that big. I mean, you end up specifying all the various sizes and stuff. I haven't grown to love that yet, so, and it's not adopted yet, so I don't really need to care. But those are other approaches people are making instead of all these various techniques for responsive images. They're trying to get it built into browsers. So I kind of like the source set personally. If I could say, here's my lowest 1x, 2x, 3x, 4x, and let the browser figure out the right one to get, that would be cool. If that comes to fruition. So that's kind of responsive. I've also used jQuery mobile before. When I know I'm going to create an M.dot specific site for a smartphone, jQuery mobile plays pretty well. I don't like the way jQuery mobile would look at a desktop and it will run. I just don't happen to like the way that it looks. It's a UI framework. I'll show you what it runs like. So what I do in here is I need to do some additional markup. So I'm going to say, here's a logical page within my HTML. It's going to be a travel. And then I've got a list of countries you can travel to. So let me show you what it looks like visually. So does it run on a desktop? Yes. Is that what I want my desktop to look like? But if I'm doing an M.dot specific, it does do a decent job. Now imagine that that's a phone. It's got decent animation as I transition, supports back, uses Ajax to make the calls to get more content. I can embed multiple pages in a single page. You know, a physical HTML page can have a set of logical jQuery mobile pages. And really it's just augmenting my content with these various roles that jQuery mobile is aware of. And the other thing I don't love, this looks very iOS-ish to me. I was still waiting for somebody to make, and I haven't seen it yet, a style sheet that is appropriate for other platforms. Like, you know, if it had a Windows phone and an Android, so I could theme this to look like the right mobile environment that you're used to using, that would be more appropriate to me. There are a lot of separate mobile sites. So I just gave you a list if you want to go look at them to see what those look like. And again, if it makes sense for you because you can't redo your entire site or you don't want to. I honestly think if you have a mobile, your mobile website has to be a lot different than your desktop site, then responsive probably isn't right for you. This is, doing a mobile specific makes sense. It kind of depends on what makes sense when your users are on that. There are some Apple specific things to be aware of. On iOS, people can actually add to the home screen websites. I don't know if you've seen that before. So it looks like it's an app icon. So we've actually installed some of our websites and they look like an app, so the user has no idea that they're not, right? But they're actually a website, so you can do that. You can control the icon pictures. You can specify that it should run full screen, so all the browser Chrome goes away. So that tablet one I worked on internally, they wanted to make it look like we were replacing basically a native iOS app. And so I had to hide the browser Chrome and play some tricks to make it look like it was native so that they weren't concerned they lost their app and got a website. So, some testing tools. Obviously, using devices is primarily how we test. Obviously, we don't have thousands of devices at my company, so that the problem with that is that we can only see what we have. And so that makes it a little difficult. There are some emulators you can get. I'm interested in some subscription services that I've looked at but haven't used yet, like Keynote, Device Anywhere, those kind of places that have a lab of mobile devices that they can point at your site and kind of show you here the screenshots of what this looked like across the different devices. Device Anywhere, I believe, is one that I can also, if you want to say, remote desktop into a device. So if I have a specific, somebody comes and says, I have an iPhone 4 on whoever, you know, I'm not going to have all those combinations, but you can pay a subscription service so then you could connect to one, see it as if that person was, and then you don't need to have as many devices. I haven't got that far yet to pull the trigger on one, but I think those are interesting. I use Fiddler all the time, so almost every day I have some issue where something doesn't work, and I'm using Fiddler on my desktop, so I'm just so accustomed to Fiddler being the answer to all my life's problems. So I started doing devices, and it was just kind of irritating because Fiddler didn't run on my phone and my tablet. But what you can do is you can actually run Fiddler. So what I do at home, I use my laptop. I run Fiddler on my laptop. You can actually set it to allow remote connections. So if you go under Fiddler, say connections, say allow remote computers to connect. Pay attention to the port, that's the default port. I'll run this on my laptop. Now I go on, and it's really easy with iOS. You go into iOS, you go into, it's not under Safari, which is where I thought it was. You go under Wi-Fi, manually set a proxy server. find out the IP address of your laptop, use that as your proxy server address on your iOS device, and now all of your traffic from your phone and your iPad will get cycled through your laptop so you can still use Fiddler. So I've done a lot of troubleshooting that way. Android devices tend to be a little more difficult to set the proxies on. So I gave a link here for, you can set up Fiddler to be a reverse proxy, where it'll just respond at an IP address, it'll take the request, forward it on, so you don't need to configure a proxy in your device. But both of those, with those two approaches, it's still very capable for me to run Fiddler on my laptop and still see all the traces for all the mobile devices that I want to watch when I'm on wireless. Okay, so I mean, obviously, I'm setting up my mobile device on my own wireless network at home. It's not watching it over Verizon or whoever my carrier is. That makes sense. So performance, I had a talk on this morning, so if you saw that, otherwise, I do have a Pluralsight course on, I've got some trial cards. The stuff I talked about this morning, as far as what you need to worry about from a web perspective, is all that much more important for mobile. And you've got 3G connections, things like expiration. So again, expirations, you're just telling the browser, this folder, please keep that stuff for X number of days. That way, when I do get it pushed down to a device, they won't have to come back and ask for it. The phones don't have as much cache size as the desktop, but I'm doing all that I can do, right? As the server provider, I'm telling you to keep it. If you don't have enough space, you come back and get it. At least I'm telling you so that if you do have space in your cache, you're not coming back and downloading it again. Talked about compression. Phones have a lot more latency than desktops do for network connections. So it's all that much more important to cut the number of requests you make back to the server, because that's a real killer in mobile. And so minification, consolidation, sprites, any of the techniques I talked about to reduce the number of requests you make between the client device and the server, it's a huge advantage in mobile. So really focus on those ones that reduce that number of requests. Okay? That's my blog, my email, the Twitter information. The app, if you have the DevWeek app, it has a place where you can do eval, so I would appreciate it if you could do an eval. I'll stick around up here if you have any questions. Like I said, I've got month-long trial cards for Pluralsight where I go into perf and some of this other stuff, if you're interested in that. Otherwise, I got a whopping 3 minutes if you have other questions. Yes?
So one question, what is your computer site?
What's my e-commerce site? Schwann's. Yep, SCHWANS. We also own Red Baron and Tony's, so the responsive one we just finished was for Tony's.com.
And I was going to say, and obviously you designed the front end, put it back to SQL back end, is it?
Yeah, so those are, the Schwann's is the ASP.NET site. Tony's is actually pure HTML, and I actually talked to a back-end web API, not web API officially, but I have an API that the front end talks to. So designers get to do a lot of the bootstrap and that work up front, and then talk to us. So those are mostly HTML. Anything else?
On your mobile sites, you often concerned with kind of bandwidth considerations. So our mobile specific site is very lightweight. It's only the one page that actually uses old style jQuery templates for jQuery mobile app. Is that a consideration for you? Or
Yeah, so I mean, I think the high-level question is, knowing that you're in a more bandwidth-constrained, potentially environment than normal, does that change how I do most of my development stuff?
Yes, I guess that's
I hear a lot of people knocking the jQuery and stuff, as far as don't use big JavaScript libraries when you're in mobile. My perspective, I want to use something that's going to work across all three of them. If I'm doing my minification, bundling, and compression correctly, I'm not that concerned. I wouldn't want to throw out jQuery personally for all the stuff I get from it for plugins and such. We did end up replacing a lot of the plugins we use from jQuery when we used Bootstrap, because it had mobile dialogues and stuff built in already. So the carousels and the modables and all that stuff I had used jQuery for, but Bootstrap's not small either. And so I think for me, I've got to use those kind of techniques to get my site done. I focus more on the image optimization, bundling, compression, that kind of stuff to get around the fact that they're somewhat large, rather than throw them out.
Would that be more on a kind of a one-site responsive style? Do you have a different site architecture if you're having a mobile specific site, so an MDOT.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think I would change my tune and not take advantage of something in one versus the other. If I looked at, for instance, the only thing I would question, I guess, is if I was doing an MDOT specific site, if I'm only using 2 or 3 things from jQuery, then I might be a lot more eager to go see, is there an alternative to that? Because there are lighter libraries than jQuery for some of the functionality, but typically for me, I use a lot of it. So I mean, it's not really a good option for me to try to replace even on an MDOT specific one, if that makes sense. Anything else? Otherwise, thank you for coming.